Saul's. The sign read above the small shop, with the words, "Walk in their shoes," just below it, caught my attention during my walk home from work. Even the faded sneakers I had on seemed to fixate on it. As I opened the door, a little bell chimed overhead, and the distinct scent of leather filled the air. Rows of shelves stood throughout the space, stacked with all sorts of shoes, each pair different from the next. Behind the counter sat an older man, who looked up when he saw me enter. "Hello there. Need any help?" Just looking around," I replied. "All right," he said calmly. "Let me know if you do." I slowly walked the aisles, my eyes scanning the shelves packed with footwear. Sneakers, boots, high heels, you name it. Almost all of them looked used or worn in some way. The first pair I picked up were black loafers, the kind you'd wear to a formal event or to work. The leather was creased but still intact, and the buckle gleamed faintly under the lights. Further down the aisle, I came across a pair of white Air Force Ones. They had some stains, but nothing that couldn't be cleaned up with a little effort. I added them to the growing pile in my arms. Eventually, I spotted a pair of scuffed, dark brown boots. They looked like they'd be perfect for winter, so I tucked them in with the other two pairs. Trying to stay within my budget, I decided that was enough. I carried them over to the front counter and laid them down. The old man glanced up and began tapping the keys of an ancient cash register. "This everything?" he asked. I gave him a small nod. He looked over each pair, pressing the buttons with a rhythm that matched his gaze. I pulled some crumpled bills from my pocket and handed them over while he slid each pair into plain brown boxes. "Enjoy their shoes," he said as he handed me the bags. "Have a good one." "Thanks," I replied, raising an eyebrow at his choice of words. Their shoes. It was a strange thing to say, and it lingered in my thoughts as I walked back home. Once inside, I placed the boxes on the floor and began to unpack them. Since it wasn't your typical shoe store, I had to hope the shoes would fit. I figured I'd start with the loafers since they'd likely see the most use. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I slid one onto my foot. I wiggled my toes inside, adjusting to the snug but comfortable fit. Wanting to be sure, especially since one of my feet was slightly bigger, I tried on the second shoe. That's when it started. A wave of sleepiness rolled over me, sudden and overwhelming. My eyelids grew heavy, my vision swam, and a sick feeling stirred in my gut. The familiar comfort of my bed vanished, replaced by something hard and cold. The temperature dropped, and when I blinked the blur away, I found myself somewhere entirely different. I was sitting in a hospital room. The rhythmic beep of a heart monitor echoed through the silence. I looked down and realized I was wearing unfamiliar clothes, except for the black loafers which were still on my feet. That's when I felt it. A hand wrapped tightly around mine, trembling. Lying in the bed was an elderly woman. Her face was pale, her hair thin, and exhaustion clung to her like a shroud. I didn't recognize her, yet everything inside me screamed that I knew exactly who she was. Felt like she had raised me, and now I was watching her slip away. Tears welled up in my eyes as grief flooded my chest. She turned her head slowly, meeting my eyes with a weak smile. "I can't do this without you. I can't be here with you," I said, voice trembling with emotion. It was like I was speaking without any control, yet at the same time it didn't feel forced. Felt natural. "Yes, you can," she whispered. "I've spent my whole life preparing you." I leaned closer, and she pressed a soft kiss to my forehead. With a weak smile, she reached up and wiped a tear from my cheek. "Take care of Gigi for me, okay?" I nodded, smiling through the tears. Somehow, that name hit something deep inside me. I didn't know a Gigi, but I also did. Her face appeared in my mind, my sister. A stranger, yet so familiar it ached. Everything about the moment felt heartbreakingly real, like I was living someone else's final goodbye. The beeping on the monitor flattened. I sat there, tears pouring down my face as I watched the life leave her body. The weight of it all crushed me. Then I noticed a cracked window letting in a faint breeze. Something inside me snapped. Without thinking, I rushed toward it and forced it open. The wind whipped past me as I climbed up onto the ledge. I held the sides for balance and looked down. The height made my head spin. My stomach churned. The ground below looked far enough. I turned to glance back one last time, at her body lying peacefully in the bed. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and then I jumped. The air screamed past me as I fell, eyes squeezed shut, wind roaring in my ears. In that horrifying descent, one thought filled my mind. I didn't want to die, but it was too late. The ground was closing in fast, and I was far too far from the window now to change anything. I braced for impact. There was a sickening crunch, then blackness, and just like that, I was back in my bedroom. My feet were flat on the wooden floor. My entire body trembled as my eyes darted around the room. I wanted to convince myself it was just a dream, but it had felt too real. I had felt every second of it. I yanked the loafers off and shoved them back in the box. Then I shoved that box deep into my closet. But even though it terrified me to my core, something about the experience fascinated me. The idea of literally walking in someone else's shoes, of living their memories, their final moments. It was haunting, but impossible to ignore. I decided to wait a day before trying the next pair. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I couldn't stop thinking about the man whose life I had stepped into. How badly he must have wanted to go back, but couldn't. It rattled me to my core. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wear my usual worn-out running shoes for my jog. Instead, I opened the closet and pulled out the box that held the white sneakers I'd bought from that strange little store. Dropping the box to the floor, I took a deep breath, then slid one foot into the first sneaker. As I prepared myself for what might happen next, I slipped on the second. I waited, expecting the heaviness to come crashing down, that strange wave of disconnection from reality. But nothing. I sat there for a few moments, shoes loosely tied on my feet, and still nothing. No haze, no nausea, no shift in temperature. For a second, I thought maybe the loafers were just a fluke. Maybe they happened to belong to someone who had passed. Maybe the whole experience had been some wild dream brought on by stress and exhaustion. So I shrugged it off. I jogged down the stairs of my apartment building, stepping out into the morning sun. Warm rays washed over me as I queued up my favorite playlist and popped in my earbuds. Then, as I started moving one foot after the other, I felt it, just like last time. The world around me began to dissolve. My vision blurred. My surroundings melted into nothing. Yet, oddly enough, I still felt my legs moving. I was still running, even though I had no idea where I was or who I was. The music in my ears distorted into static and faded to silence. Suddenly, I felt the soles of my feet hit solid ground again, hard and fast. My lungs burned. My heart pounded. I was flying down a hallway, a school hallway. I didn't know why I was running, but every inch of my body was screaming in fear. Something was chasing me, something I couldn't see, but I could feel. Then, I noticed a smear of blood on the floor. A long, uneven trail ran alongside me as I sprinted, leading to the body of a young girl sprawled on the ground. Blood pooled around her, soaking her backpack. Bullet holes pierced through her clothes. The sound of gunfire exploded behind me, sharp and deafening. And suddenly, I remembered why I was running. I pushed harder, legs screaming as they carried me forward. All around me, chaos echoed, screams, Crashes, the terrifying crack of gunshots. School bags and binders littered the floor like debris from a disaster. I needed a place to hide. Reaching the nearest classroom door, I pounded on it with both fists. "Please," I cried. "I'm a student. I swear. Let me in. I don't want to die." The door cracked open, and someone yanked me inside. A teacher, her face pale, hands trembling, slammed it shut again and locked it. "Get down," she whispered harshly. I dropped to the floor and huddled in the corner with the others. Students packed tight, their eyes wide with horror. Some were sobbing quietly. Others trembled as they clutched their phones, fingers flying across screens, typing what might be their last words. I fumbled for mine. "There's a shooter. I love you." I texted my parents. I didn't even wait for their response. Couldn't. Outside, more gunfire rang out, closer this time. We all froze. A few students held their mouths shut to keep from screaming. Someone was whispering a prayer. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. Then, a sudden burst of gunfire tore through the wooden door. We scattered. Those who didn't move fast enough slumped to the ground, blood splattering the walls behind them. I crawled across the floor, squeezing into another corner with a few other survivors. Light from the hallway poured through the holes in the door. And then, the door slammed open. The shooter stepped in. Without hesitation, he opened fire again. The teacher was the first to fall, bullets ripping through her chest. Students screamed as he turned the weapon on us. The sound was unbearable, chaotic, final. I couldn't tell if I had been hit. I couldn't feel anything but cold shock. Then silence. Everything went black. And suddenly I was back on my street, my feet planted firmly on the sidewalk. I doubled over, gagging as I vomited onto the pavement. My heart was still hammering inside my chest. It was too much, too real. Stumbling back into my apartment, I tore the sneakers off and flung them into their box. I didn't want to see them. I didn't want to think about them. Whatever curiosity I had before was completely gone. I had no intention of trying the final pair of boots. I stuffed the sneakers deep into my closet, right alongside the loafers. The third pair, the boots, I didn't even glance at. Curiosity might have gotten the better of me before, but now it was fear that had taken over. The kind of fear that lingers in your bones long after the moment has passed. Weeks slipped by, and I tried to put the whole thing behind me. Tried to convince myself it was some bizarre hallucination or trauma-induced dream. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even open the closet again. Eventually, time dulled the edge of those memories. Months passed. I moved out of my apartment and into a house with my girlfriend, Madison. The move was chaotic, as most are. I was working long hours, and she did most of the unpacking while I was at work. Of course, I never told her about the shoes. How could I? How do you explain something like that to someone you love without sounding completely insane? To her, they were just old shoes in plain brown boxes. One cold morning, I overslept. I woke up in a panic, realizing I had minutes to get out the door. I was scrambling, pulling on clothes, grabbing my keys. I didn't even look at what shoes I grabbed. I just shoved my feet into the first pair I saw by the door. The boots. The heavy, dark brown ones. I didn't notice at first. I was too focused on getting into my car, muttering curses under my breath. But as I slammed the car door shut, I felt it again. The world around me started to fade. The noise of the morning traffic dulled to silence. My vision clouded, and when it cleared, I wasn't in my driveway anymore. I was still in a car, but it wasn't mine. I sat in the driver's seat, parked in the middle of a dark, wooded trail. Heavy air hung around me, damp and still. Then I heard it, screaming, muffled, panicked. It was coming from the trunk. And just like that, I knew. This wasn't like the other times. This time, I wasn't the victim. I stepped out of the car, gravel crunching under the boots. I moved slowly toward the back, my hand, gloved in leather, gripping the trunk's edge. I opened it. Inside was a woman. Her face was soaked in tears, mouth gagged with cloth, hands and legs tied together with rough rope. She thrashed when she saw me, her screams muffled but desperate. "No, please!" she cried, her voice cracking as she tried to speak around the gag. I grabbed her by the hair and yanked her from the trunk. She hit the ground hard, gasping, crying, fighting to crawl away. I dragged her along a dirt path, her body twisting in protest. Ahead of us was a freshly dug hole human-sized. She wriggled and kicked, managing to knock the gag from her mouth. "Help! Help me!" she screamed into the night. "There's no one here, sweetheart," I said in a cold, detached tone. "No, please, stop," she sobbed, trying to kick her legs, trying anything. I slammed her onto her back and straddled her chest, her face twisted in terror. "Shut your fucking mouth." Her eyes widened as my hands closed around her throat. The leather gloves creaked as I squeezed, her body thrashing violently beneath me. She tried to knee me in the back. She tried to scream, but my grip only tightened. Her face turned red, then purple. She couldn't breathe. Her lips trembled, and then she stopped. Her eyes locked onto the sky, the fight fading from them. She was gone. I didn't even blink. Then, snap. The sound of a twig breaking pierced the silence. I whipped my head around. A shadow moved through the trees. Then, bang. Pain exploded in my throat. My mouth filled with blood as I fell onto my side next to her body. A police officer emerged from the trees, gun still raised. He rushed to the woman, checked her pulse, then started yelling into his radio. I gasped, blood pouring from the hole in my neck. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The stars above blurred as my vision faded. Blackness swallowed everything. And then, I was back in my own car, still gripping the steering wheel. I gasped and pulled my hands away, trembling. A tear slid down my cheek as I looked down at the boots on my feet. I didn't go to work that day. Instead, I went straight home. I dug out the other 2 boxes, grabbed all 3, and sped back to that little store. The moment I stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled, and the old man looked up. "Returning something?" he asked casually. "Yeah," I muttered, barely able to speak. He gave a knowing nod. "Of course, the usual." I placed the boxes on the counter, still shaking. He began counting the refund in worn bills. "So," he said, "how was it? What? Walking in their shoes. What was it like?" I stared at him, my mouth dry. "It was awful." He grinned. "Well, now you know how they felt. Or, I guess, you already did." He handed me the money with a calm smile. "Have a good day." I grabbed the bills and practically ran out the door. The next morning, I passed the shop again on my way to work, only now it was gone. The windows were dusty and dark. The sign was missing, but a faint outline of the old logo still clung to the bricks. No note, no explanation. It had simply vanished. I never found out who that man was. I never learned where he got those shoes or why he sold them. And I never saw anyone else enter the store. Not once. Sometimes I wonder if it was ever really there at all. Maybe it only existed for me. Maybe I was meant to learn something. But whatever the lesson was, it was one I wish I'd never had to learn.